This presentation is on Chapter 8 of the Criminological Theory textbook. We're going to talk a little bit about conflict theory. I'm not going to go into great detail on all of the different conflict theorists. You can read about them in the book. I'm just going to give kind of an overview of what this branch of criminology is all about. Critical theory really focuses attention on the conflict and struggle that exists between people in society, or more accurately, between different groups in society. And we usually look at groups that are in power versus those that really have no power or are oppressed in some way. And these types of theories usually look at those conflicts in society, usually power struggles, as being a major source of what we call criminal behavior. Most of critical theory finds its roots in one way or another in the thinking of Karl Marx. Now, one of the things you need to realize is that Karl Marx never actually wrote about crime, except just in very brief passing, but he didn't really give the subject a lot of attention. But using Marx's ideas, criminologists have developed theories and use these Marxist ideas to formulate some ideas about how they believe society works. So just going through these bullet points here, one of the major things that you see in looking at Marxist ideas and critical theory is the economic disparities that exist in our society. And Karl Marx wrote a lot about the division of labor, where there's kind of a working class, and then there's the class that employs all of those people, the people that control all of the resources in society. And Karl Marx saw this arrangement really as very unequal and oppressive, that the people who were controlling all of the resources were in effect oppressing the lower class and just paying them the bare minimum that they would accept for their labor, and they never really would be able to get ahead. So, in the end, Karl Marx's solution to all of this was a revolution followed by a socialist government in which all of the resources were owned by the government. That has its own pluses and minuses, but that's not really what we get into in criminology. In criminology, we're just looking at this conflict that exists between classes and groups to try and describe why we might get criminal behavior. Continuing on with these ideas, Marx essentially said that there's this conflict of interest between these different groups, and that those conflicts are increased because resources are not distributed equally. And those who receive less of the resources of society would naturally question the legitimacy of that arrangement. Is it fair that I'm a working person just making a minimum wage when the boss or the corporate owners are making millions and have everything they could possibly need? And again, there are arguments for these things one way or the other, but Karl Marx's view was that this is an unfair arrangement, and the lower class would see it as unfair, and that this would cause unrest. And you essentially, when you arrange things in this way, Karl Marx said you're just going to have conflict naturally, because you've created an unfair situation where the people on the bottom are going to try to equalize things somewhat. At the heart of all of this really was this kind of an attack on capitalism. And of course, our society is a capitalistic society. Everybody's kind of fends for themselves and earns as much as they possibly can. And if you can make a bigger profit than someone else, then you get to keep it. But Karl Marx again saw this as kind of a problematic arrangement. So for Karl Marx, capitalism really is at the root of a lot of the conflicts. And a lot of the other theorists you'll read about in the book, people like Bonger and several others, just talk specifically about capitalism and how it creates the problems that we're trying to fix. And essentially they argue that as long as you have a capitalistic society, you are always going to have these problems. It's just one of the natural consequences of it. And so for these early critical theorists, they would argue that if you want to eliminate what we call crime, then you have to just set society up in a different way. That setting it up so that it's unfair and a bunch of people have more than others is always going to result in some kind of problem. So that's some of the, just a very brief overview of the early thoughts of Karl Marx. It really wasn't until the 1960s, and Karl Marx did most of his writing in the 1800s, I believe. But it wasn't really until the 1960s that criminologists started kind of latching onto these ideas, and conflict theory really became kind of its own branch of criminology. And we've talked before about the unrest that was going on in the 1960s. There was a lot of distrust of the government, a lot of dissatisfaction with the way society was running. And so it kind of made a real good environment for something like, conflict theory to come into its own. And you sometimes you'll see, just as a side note, the terms conflict theory or critical theory. They really kind of refer to the same thing. The book, I think, mostly calls it conflict theory, so we'll go with that. But again, it's just a reference to the conflicts within society. So here are some of the reasons that conflict theory really became popular in the 1960s. One is you had the war in Vietnam that was going on. It was an extremely unpopular war. The American public did not like it, and a lot of people were dying, and even the soldiers that went to fight in the war were somewhat despised by the American public. And that's right or wrong, that's just what happened. And so there was just this real kind of anti-government, anti-establishment sentiment that created. And that precipitated in a lot of ways this growth of a really big counterculture in the United States, which we refer to usually as kind of the hippie movement. But it was just this idea that there was this whole group of people that were purposefully trying to do things and live in a way that was completely the opposite of what quote normal American society would have told them to do. And then you also had again, this was an era of lots and lots of political protesting, and one of the main things people protested was the issue of discrimination against minorities was still a big issue, and the government was using the police force power to really suppress a lot of this political dissent and a lot of this protesting that was going on. And I mean, the police really were just, in most cases, they're just, doing a job, doing what they're told to do as an employee. But the police were being used as a tool of the people higher up in the government to really push their agenda, is what the conflict theorists would argue. That it's not the police that were the problem, it was the people using the police to further their agenda was really at the heart of the problem. It's this, the powerful people using the tools at their disposal to keep the rest of the people down. Lastly, you had this impression that started to develop in kind of our society's collective conscience that our society was composed of groups that were in conflict. And so you started, instead of this idea that, oh, we're all one big happy family and we're all working for the same goals, the 1960s were very much characterized by kind of this them and us mentality, that whoever them and us are, that just kind of depended on which group you belong to. But society was characterized by this really strong conflict that was going on, from a social perspective, as far as how society was going to run and how things should be handled. Your book goes on in great detail to describe several influential conflict theorists, several of their theories, and what you'll see as you read through those is that even though they all have their own different little take on how they develop their particular conflict theory, you'll see that they pretty much have the same general ideas running through them. They're all going to deal with this concept of conflict between groups in society, and it usually centers on either power or resources or both. And so as you read through the theories, keep that in mind, that those are the general ideas. And then here we'll see just a couple of factors that kind of precipitated this shift to this new form of conflict theory that we started to see in criminology in this time period. One is that there started to be a lot of skepticism about attributing crime or criminal behavior to characteristics of people. A lot of people at this time rejected the idea that there could be something about you that would cause you to become a criminal. It was really seen as more of a structural issue of how society was set up. So there was a lot of skepticism about criminological theories that link the causes of crime to people. There was also a shift in one of the fundamental assumptions of criminological theory. Traditionally, it was kind of assumed that problems with the criminal justice system could be traced back to incompetent or corrupt people within the system. That, more minorities are getting locked up than they should because there are people in the system that are racist. You would find those kinds of possible explanations. There is kind of a rejection of those types of explanations, to say, no, it's not the people in the system, it's the system itself that creates these problems. The argument of conflict theory is that it doesn't really matter who's running the system. The system itself just inherently creates the problems that conflict theorists talked about. Another assumption that was rejected in the movement for this conflict theory was that the criminal law represented the collective will of the people. Usually when we talk about the criminal law, we like to say things like, the criminal code reflects the broad, ideas that we have of a society about right and wrong. And that, even though there are going to be some people here and there that disagree with whatever, a lot of times we try to argue that the criminal code really reflects the collective will of our society. Conflict theorists don't agree with that. They do not believe that the criminal law represents the collective will of the people. What conflict theorists would say is that the criminal law probably reflects the collective will of the people who made the criminal law, and that the criminal law is designed to oppress everybody else so that those powerful people don't lose their position. That's probably what conflict theorists would say. But another problem that conflict theorists saw with how we talked about these ideas is that, and you've had probably other classes where you talked about the UCR data, which we usually use for crime statistics that are reported by police departments. Looking at those data, it's very clear that what we quote as our crime rate, our crime statistics, doesn't really reflect anything about the amount of actual criminal behavior occurring. We know that not all criminal behavior gets reported. We don't really know how much crime gets committed. All we know is how much gets reported. And so it became clear, to conflict theorists that our crime statistics really were just a reflection of the behavior of the authorities. How much crime did they actually respond to? Because even if a crime gets reported, they don't necessarily have to document it. And sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. So for crime statistics to exist, the police have to get called, they have to show up, and then they have to decide to actually document whatever's being reported. So crime statistics became, widely viewed as just really a reflection of the government's actions, not the actions of citizens. Okay, so I'm not really going to go into great detail about a lot of the different conflict theorists. You can read about those. But I do want to mention one or two really influential ones that you definitely need to know something about. One is Richard Quinney, and he is now retired, but he was very active in this area through the 1950s, 1960s, I think even early 70s he was still publishing. But he's kind of an interesting guy. He was kind of what we call a philosophical idealist. He didn't really care too much about how the world was. He liked thinking a little bit more about how it should be, or how it ought to be, and how do we get there. But what he said is that there's really no objective reality beyond our own conception of it. And he really argued kind of the same thing about social reality, that social reality is really just kind of what we define it to be. And as we, as our perceptions and interpretations of different behaviors change over time, what we consider criminal will change over time. And this is pretty easy to see. The easiest example is look at what's going on with the marijuana laws out in Colorado and Washington and other places. It used to be that possession of marijuana was universally criminal in this country. Now, if you do it in Colorado, you're not a criminal. But if you cross the state line and do it somewhere else, well, then you are. So again, these ideas of what we consider criminal and not criminal change quite a bit over time. And it really just kind of ebbs and flows with the ideas of the times. So for Richard Quinney, the theoretical problem that he wanted to solve was not talking about why do people commit crime. The problem he thought was more important was trying to figure out the process by which we ascribed meanings to different behaviors. And this might make more sense if you realize that Quinney's training and doctoral studies were really in the field of sociology. There really were no criminology programs back then. So this is what he thought was more interesting, is that he thought that really asking why do people commit crime was really just the wrong question to ask. What he wanted to answer was, why do we call some behaviors criminal and others not? In his book called The Social Reality of Crime, Quinney laid out a theory and he gave 6 propositions that he thought were important in talking about this problem of crime. The first is that crime is defined by Quinney as the definition of human conduct that is created by the powerful people in our society. In Quinney's world, there was no objective agreement about something is inherently criminal. Quinney would say that something is only criminal when we ascribe that meaning to it. Even something as serious as murder. The only reason it's a criminal act is because we attach this meaning to that act and pass a law. If we did not do that, technically, it wouldn't be illegal, it wouldn't be considered criminal. It's only because we define it that way. So the second proposition that Quinney lays out here is that criminal definitions describe behaviors that conflict with the interests of the segments of society that have the power to shape public policy. So what he's saying is that there's this group of people that's in power in our society, and they have certain interests that they want to maintain. And what Quinney would argue is that the things that become illegal are the things that that group thinks poses a conflict to their position. So essentially the argument is that the powerful people will make laws that keep them in power and prevent other people from taking power. The third proposition, which kind of is an extension of the second one really, it just says that these criminal definitions are applied by the people in our society that have all of the power. And that means they have the power to enforce and administer these laws that we make. So, these criminal definitions don't come from, the least powerful part of society. They come from the most powerful part of society and get applied to everybody else. The fourth proposition of Quinney's theory essentially says, and I'm not going to read it because it's confusing, but essentially what he's saying in the fourth proposition here is that all of the behaviors we engage in have different probabilities of being defined as criminal. Some of the things we do might be, would never be classified as criminal. Other things that we do might have a real high likelihood of being classified as criminal, depending on what kinds of behaviors you're engaging in. And so it's, we structure our behavior patterns based on the probabilities that something might be considered criminal or not. And then the fifth proposition is that these conceptions of crime that are instituted are diffused throughout society by various means of communication. So all he's saying there is that the powerful people don't just make the laws and not tell anybody about it. They make sure that everybody knows, or at least the most people possible know, so that we can try and encourage obedience or conformance with the laws. The last proposition of Quinney's theory, we'll just read it. It says, the social reality of crime is constructed by the formulation and application of criminal definitions, the development of behavior patterns related to criminal definitions, and the construction of criminal conceptions. So what this is saying is that what we call crime, we talk about crime all the time and we don't always really define it. But this phenomenon that we call crime, Quinney would say, is constructed by how we create and apply criminal definitions to different behaviors, and then how behavior patterns in society emerge in relationship to those definitions that have been created. So again, all Quinney's really saying with these 6 propositions is that crime is something we create, and it's created really by the powerful class to kind of delineate the behaviors from the lower class that won't be tolerated. So that's the essential argument. Now, whether that argument is entirely correct or not is another matter, but that's the essential argument that Quinney was putting forth. And so you can see how this theory has running all through it. And again, it's not really a theory of crime in the traditional sense of something like strain theory. It's really this theory of how we define crime, and really what you see running through this whole theory, which is common with other theories of this type, conflict theories, is that it's really based on the power struggle between different classes in society and how the powerful people define different behaviors in our society. One of the major contributions that Richard Quinney made to the field of criminology, beyond what we've talked about already, is the development of what he called peacemaking criminology. And this is a branch of criminology that some people dismiss as being kind of, it's kind of out there and doesn't have a lot of real-world application. But it does have some interesting ideas that I think are worth considering. And what peacemaking criminology is all about is that it accepts this idea that conflict is at the root of crime. But what Richard Quinney said was that if you have someone that commits a crime and then you punish them, all you're doing is furthering this conflict by doing harm to someone who did harm to someone else. I mean, it's kind of a different way of looking at punishment. I mean, normally we think of punishment and we think, oh, well, yeah, if someone commits a crime, then they need to be punished. What peacemaking criminology says is that, well, maybe people don't need to be punished. Maybe what they need is to be, shown how their actions are harmful, and get them to do what they can to rebuild the bond with them in society that has been broken. So it's kind of this kind of an idea. And so it's very, and actually, if you remember, restorative justice types of principles came out of peacemaking criminology. But peacemaking really is about building trust and a sense of community. And so what Richard Quinney would say is, look, if someone commits a crime, something that we've all agreed we don't want people to do, well, they've broken this trust or bond that we had with them, presumably. And so instead of just locking them away somewhere or harming them in some way that creates more crime in the future, we should do what we can to get them to see what they did was wrong, and try to get them to rebuild the social bonds. So in a general sense, that's what peacemaking criminology is all about, is this idea that we're all one kind of society, we all have to live together, and things function best if we all work for the interest of everybody else. Peacemaking criminology reflects the idea that people who have no power in society realize that they probably won't ever have any power. That they won't be able to achieve their goals by overpowering the people who are opposing them. This is, but also it also reflects this assumption that two wrongs don't make a right. And, that's a simple way of saying it. That the basic premise of peacemaking criminology is doing harm to somebody to correct whatever harm they did is not the right approach. Really the way our society works now, it's almost more the eye for an eye mentality of, well, if you hurt them, then we're going to hurt you. Peacemaking criminology says that's not the right way to go about it. Like I mentioned, restorative justice is one of the policies that has come out of this idea of thinking. The biggest criticism of peacemaking criminology is that it's just too idealistic. This is not surprising because American culture is not really oriented towards these kinds of conciliatory approaches. But this is the biggest criticism of this line of thinking, is that it's just, it's utopian. You're talking about things we can never accomplish, so why bother? But whether that's right or wrong, what peacemaking criminology and really all of conflict criminology has done is even though it may not have had huge impacts on policies necessarily, it has impacted a great deal how criminologists think about these problems. and it's brought to light certain conditions in our society that we probably need to consider in thinking about this problem of crime and how we go about dealing with it. So, like I was saying, just to wrap this up, conflict theory, peacemaking criminology, and all these other theories that surround these ideas really have just kind of reoriented the discussion in a lot of ways in criminology. I mean, think about some of the things we talked about at the very beginning of the class, where the theories of the day were rational choice types of theories, where they said, oh well, people seek pleasure and pain, they'll maximize their pleasure and they'll minimize their pain, they'll weigh the consequences and do what's best. Well, that's a pretty simplistic explanation of why people do what they do, and we know that it's not really accurate. But there was no consideration of the power imbalances in society, the conditions that people found themselves living in, the differential opportunities that they have in life. And so really conflict theory was just another branch of criminology that brought to light a lot of these kinds of ideas so that we could incorporate them into our thinking about this problem of crime. Because for some reason, a lot of people think they know all the answers when it comes to crime because they've watched the news or they read a newspaper article or whatever. Everybody has pretty strong opinions about how we should deal with crime. But the reality is there are no easy answers, and if you overlook some of these things and you don't take them into consideration, you're just not really examining the whole picture. So keep that in mind as you think about your own opinions and attitudes about how we should address this problem. So that's it for this time. Make sure you take a look at the chapter, become familiar with these theories and some of the people that were involved with them, and I'll talk to you soon.